Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, Namaste. Welcome back to the course on Geographic Information System. In the previous class, we have learnt about different GIS softwares, libraries, etc. We looked at how GRAS performs, how OGR and GDAL as a powerful tools or libraries have provided in any of those softwares. Then we looked at QGIS, then we looked at FragStat. So, with all of these, let's look at what is the pros and cons of an open source software. So let's understand that in terms of comparing both of the open source and a proprietary software. So in today's class, I would look at an open source as an open source and how it is useful. Then the cost of ownership when you have an open source software versus a proprietary software, the features, the quality in an open source software and proprietary software, the principles and rights as a user, as a developer, and as a manager. Okay, for in an open source software, what are your principles, what are your rights when you compare it with the proprietary software? That is what we would see in today's class. So when you look at the total cost of ownership, open source has much for a lower price. Okay, as I said, it may be just 10 distribution price. Otherwise, most of the open source software is free. Okay, when I say lower price, it is the free is a very good price normally. So that is what is the cost of ownership. The total cost of open source is much lower. Okay, why? One is you have expertise versus certified experts. So that you have to look at in terms of whenever you are looking at an open source. Then you have vendors are starting to offer guaranteed open source solutions. That is where the cost that I am trying to say here, though I said only distribution cost occurs, but if you have a vendor who is actually guaranteeing solutions through an open source, so then you have a small cost or a certain cost that is associated with any of the software or any of the applications that is being developed. So that is where you may have some cost. Okay, but when you look at that proprietary software, comparatively it is very less. Okay, maybe it's 1/10 of the cost that a proprietary software has. Some softwares aren't compatible with the open source softwares. For example, number of Linux desktops is very less when compared to that of a Microsoft Windows today. Okay, that is there. But when I say some software isn't compatible with open source, it means to say that software has not been built for an open source, any of the open source softwares. So that's otherwise it is not because of the open source software, it is not compatible. By choosing a Linux desktop, a user forecloses on some software because it may never be created for or ported to Linux. That is what I said. So it is never created for Linux. That platform is not created. But it's when you look at GIS software, most of the softwares that has been developed, open source softwares, has always been started with the Linux. Then it has been ported to Windows or Mac, etc. Without Linux, there has been no development as far as GIS is concerned. And when you look at features, the first thing that any of the user will ask is the feature. What are the features that are there in open source? How the development happens? What kind of development is there? And how well it can compare with the features of that of a proprietary software. So the first thing that I would assure you is that open source is more reliable, always reliable. Why? It has backed community which is actually helping you out. it has bug trackers, it has people who are patching it. So that development is going on and on and on. So whenever you report something, there is always a positive outcome of what you have reported, then it is more secure. Very important in terms of whether you are using GIS. So we have emphasized security as a very important measure. So when you look at open source software, it is highly secure. How? It is with both, when we are looking at it, effective security through deployment is done in an open source software even before the code is for its effective usage is done. Okay, there is regular monitoring, there are patches, there are upgrades very fast and very previously when you look at open source software, the gap was there in terms of upgradability, in terms of its patches being released or its newer versions being released, but today it's not so. It's extremely upgradable and most importantly regularly monitored and modded. So that is very important in terms of when you have a GIS software. And when you look at when you compare the same thing with the proprietary software, it has more features. It may be easier to use peripherals like digital cameras with proprietary software. Okay, so that is one thing that has small issues, but with probably when I looked at the previous versions of Linux that had installed, it did not give me much of an issue, though I had to just configure it with some drivers. Otherwise there was no issues with even with many of the open source tools. Okay, so when there is a specific proprietary thing, then it becomes an issue. Otherwise if it's not very proprietary and it is its drivers are open, are available in as an open coded thing, there absolutely there is no issues. Or normally drivers can be even installed as an, you have open source drivers that are available which are compatible drivers, so that can be installed, which has compatible functions as far as your device is concerned. Only when it is highly proprietary and it's not distributable, only then it creates an issue. And most importantly is more user friendly. As I said, a clone program may be just as user friendly as the original. Okay, so when you are looking at proprietary, for example, many of them compare with ArcGIS and QGIS. It's not about comparing. ArcGIS is completely proprietary, so it has to give services or develop services very specific to the user community who has bought it. Okay, whereas QGIS is more intended to develop it as a powerful tool, okay, for any user to use it. Okay, so there are two visions of looking at these. Instead of comparing it, you should look at weighing balances between these two visions. Vision one is proprietary software is developed only intended to the users who are actually using it. So whatever they want, basically that is being satisfied, or maybe more visually attractive and more easier to handle. But QGIS is for a larger context where any user can use it, modify it and make it more useful. So only thing is that open source may have a bit of effort that you may have to put in, whereas in a proprietary software you may not have to do that. And when you look at the next part of it is powerful, the speed and scale. Many open source programs are generally very faster in terms of and scale larger than the proprietary alternatives. For example, OpenOffice. I am sure if many of you start using OpenOffice, I am sure you are going to quit Microsoft Office. Okay, extremely user friendly. Everything that you do it with Microsoft Office can be done with the OpenOffice. Okay, though there is Microsoft Office at the end of it has some polishing, some I mean I would call it as a gimmick. So there are a lot of things that are there in terms of because it's a proprietary software, whereas OpenOffice is extremely I mean direct, straightforward and a plain software which can be utilized the way you need. And most importantly is network friendly. So most of this open source software are network friendly. When you look at Apple build its OS X on BSD, the internet is critical, is a critical reason in terms, that's what it said. Apple recognized that they can't privately innovate internet functionality as well as fast as open source community. That is why it was there, it released it as an open source development tool. So some of it, when you see today, whatever the tools that Apple has released as an open source, as the most fast developed than any other tools, that is completely under the fortress of as a proprietary software of Apple. So that you can see it's extremely different. Okay, so when you compare this, you can easily distinguish between the proprietary and an open source. So that's how it has developed as a community. Now customizability, by its very nature, any user with enough experience can tailor software to his or her need. Okay, so when you look at open source, but proprietary, you will not be able to do it. You cannot do it basically as per the license agreement that you will have. Then you have better formats. Open source usually uses open formats available everywhere, and internationally recognized format, globally used formats are used with open source software, whereas proprietary software will have closed formats. The open source movement is partly responsible for incompatibility in proprietary software. So that is what is a meaningful exercise, because there has been now the trend is that you should have an interoperable extensions or interoperable data. So that is where there has been a change even with the proprietary software to provide an interoperable region, that is of data or extensions that are of global standards. Okay, when you look at deployment and maintenance, when you look at open source, license management is extremely easier. You don't need to worry about licenses available. Okay, for example, install any number of copies. No one is coming and asking you why you have installed 100 copies on Linux on 100 systems. Then open source companies do not bother with complicated licenses as normally in the proprietary software. No risk of illegal or licensed studios, never. Okay, so now licenses audits you don't need at all when in an open source software. And most importantly, the curbing of piracy, so much easier and straightforward. So you don't need CD keys, you don't need to do an activation like normally you do. So normally when you have installed any of the proprietary software, the first thing it asks is for, do you have a CD key or license that you have to activate it online, which this open source software never has it at all. So that is exactly why you need an open source in terms of all of these issues. And when you look at deployment and maintenance, open source has a very greater independence from companies. So that is one of the reasons that open source community has been able to develop. Today if you see, as I said, many of them compare ArcGIS with QGIS. If you look at QGIS functionalities, nowhere it lacks with any of the functionalities with ArcGIS. Okay, only that it lacks is it doesn't give you a feel of where all these functionalities are located. So you have to be a powerful user to understand, which means you should know everything where it is there to understand what kind of software it is, whereas ArcGIS it's just a drop down. Okay, so that is what is the difference. Otherwise QGIS has extreme functionalities in terms of whatever the usage to today's users is concerned. Then even if the software company goes blank, very important thing, this is, see, for example, let's say there is one software which you are completely dependent on. You have bought that software, it's a proprietary software. Okay, so now tomorrow if that company goes bankrupt and there is no updates, there is no patches, and it shuts down, so the thing that you have completely dependent on for your research, the entire thing goes in vain. Whereas here, when you have an open source software, even if the software company goes bankrupt, the entire community still has a source code. Okay, so most importantly, end of life decisions or undesirable new features can't be forced onto the user. Okay, so that is what is extremely different from an open source and a proprietary software. And whereas when I look at proprietary, for both open source and proprietary software, as experts depend on email list and community websites as well as contracted support. Okay, the quality and available of help is proportional to the interest and use, especially in the open source. That's the lacuna. For example, if there are less number of people working on a specific aspect or on a specific software, then your community support may be much slower or much not available in terms of open source software, whereas in a proprietary software it has to be available all the time. Okay, so that's how the proprietary software is far better. But with today's scenario, the context of setting this has slightly changed. Any aspect, you have someone who will reply to your questions, even in the open source community. So it's not lacking behind. Maybe in another few years you won't even find this point mentioned anywhere in the slides. And users and migration. So this is where many users are more concerned. Let's say I have a Linux build which is 12.02, then it was 14.04 sorry, for 12.10, then it came as 14.10, 16.10, 18.10, now 20.10 may come up a long term support. So now your user will be thinking about, okay, if I have this continuous support, then it would be much easier for him or her to develop along with the bug fixes that has been done. But open source is just easy in terms of doing all of these. You can it is just as easy to learn how to use it. If you start using it, then it is just a cake in terms of having it and or using it. For better or worse, most users are more familiar and more comfortable with proprietary software. It is because of the way it is represented, and many open source solutions are overtly cloning proprietary interfaces and environments. So you can see most of the proprietary environments in the open source software. So when you look at that, you won't find of much of a difference in open source softwares. But when you look at migration, normally in a proprietary software, migration is extremely expensive. There may be unforeseen problems as when existing hardware isn't actually sufficient, or when data isn't easy to migrate. So in that cases, you will have to spend a lot or put a lot of effort in or spend your precious time in order to look at the migration issues, whereas in open source it will never have the such issues. And it is difficult to integrate open source and proprietary solutions. Okay, though it is today yet a problem, I am sure that in another 2-3 years this is completely sorted out. So we will not have such issues. But most of the things that today is available is under a particular format or particular data observation. So we don't need to have such issues that is available as far as users or the migration is concerned. And when we look at the principles and rights, is very important in terms of usage of your software. Now open source is actually more empowering, because any user can fix the bugs or add the features that matter the most to them, and open source frees the user to decide for themselves. Open source is a community driven and community serving. A large community of motivated, generous programmers work together in order to develop these things. So that is how open source becomes more useful and more engaging in terms of having the principles and rights checked. So on the bottom line, if you say that, if you can give me in a nutshell what is actually this open source movement means. So it is neither when you are comparing both of them, you have to always compare apples to apples and not apples to oranges. So when you are comparing them, neither an OSS or that's an open source software nor a proprietary software is always better. Any can be better, it is because of the user. Only thing is, but clearly many cases where you are looking at research aspects, you are looking at your academic purpose, or whether you are looking at your application purpose, open source software is always better. Okay, but by definition open source software gives you more rights. So when I say rights to both user community, rights to both developer community, rights as an complete package is provided to you by the open source software. whereas proprietary, that is curtailed. Okay, so that are some reasons to say that open source software is slightly better in terms of whatever you are trying to use. But on a whole context, if you look at the entire context, when you are weighing, neither open source software nor the proprietary software is always better. When you are looking at policies must not ignore or make it difficult to use an open source software wherever applicable. That is there today, but there is a lack of more policy driven initiatives so that open source software is really used in effective decision making, and it can be challenged because of radically different assumptions and approach. Till the movement that started, especially in India in late 2000s, open source software was had a completely different image. No one used to use an open source software. They used to think that open source software is an alien thing, and everything was based out of a proprietary software. Even today you can see a lot of proprietary software being pro-candid, but open source software, the approach and the challenge that is there is being overcome slightly and much faster. Include OSS options when acquiring, then evaluate. That is, consider both reusing existing and developing new OSS. So that is one thing. I would say that this is what is a crux of an OSS. So using an existing OSS, become a powerful user, then developing a new OSS and providing it to the community will actually help the entire community who are using the open source software. So if every one of you can develop in such a context, so it would really develop as in the future can develop as a great aspect in for more researchers to go forward. Okay, because whenever most of the researches are done, normally the whatever the code that has been developed normally is in shelf, or it is just printed in your thesis and finally it is dusted. So instead, if you can put it into a software as a tool, or put it as a library which can be shared with many, someone who would be researching on it can use this thing and take it forward, it is much easier and gives you more credit and more in terms of happiness, in terms of the data being or the library being forwarded. So when you look at this thing, we have looked at open source versus proprietary software. Basically, we have compared both of them. We started with deployment of open source software, how the deployment is done, what are the intricacies in deployment, the license issues. Then we looked at users and open source software. That is where the major difference is there. The security also is an aspect that you have to consider in terms of open source software, and open source software is quite secure and rather than a proprietary software. And if you look at migration and upgradation, open source software today has extensive community which looks at migration and upgradation. For there is absolutely no issue or lacuna in terms of migration and updation. Okay, so this is what about the open source software. So in the next session, I would look at the open source geospatial foundation, how this data we are trying to put it on a global scale or make it a standard data, so that there is no issue about data. Whatever the data that is generated can be easily shared, used by others, and most importantly it doesn't go waste. Okay, whatever the data that is generated. So that is what is the next crux of the next two lectures that I would be handling in this particular session. Thank you very much. Have a nice time.